What truly defines a family? Is it the last name you carry, the blood flowing through your veins, or the walls that surround and confine you? In a grand plantation house in Alabama, these were questions no one was supposed to ask. Yet when a secret hidden behind locked doors, hushed conversations, and carefully planned lies slowly began to unravel, the very base of what once seemed like an untouchable legacy started to fracture. This is the story of a bloodline that could not be erased, no matter how deeply it was buried. A story where the truth lived in reflections, in the shape of a jaw, in the color of eyes that should never have matched. And when that truth finally rose to the surface, it did more than damage reputations. It shattered the carefully built reality of everyone who believed they knew who they were. What would you do if you learned that the person serving your dinner was your own flesh and blood? The Belmont estate spread across nearly 800 acres of fertile Alabama land, where cotton grew thick and white beneath the unforgiving southern sun. The main house stood 3 stories high, its white columns reaching upward like bold claims of permanence and power. Inside, crystal chandeliers captured the afternoon light, scattering it across mahogany furniture imported from Europe. Charles Belmont inherited the estate in 1847 after his father's death, along with everything attached to it. The land, the debts, the reputation, and the 83 enslaved people whose labor kept the entire operation alive. Charles was a man full of contradictions, educated at Harvard and well-read in philosophy, yet completely willing to uphold the brutal system that enriched him. He convinced himself he was a kind master, better than his neighbors who used the whip freely. He provided enough food, avoided separating families unless necessary, and even allowed religious gatherings on Sundays. His wife, Margaret, was a Charleston beauty who brought her own inheritance into the marriage. 30 additional enslaved people and 200 acres of land bordering the Belmont property. She was deeply religious, attending church every Sunday, organizing charity events for poor white families in town, and maintaining the image of the perfect Southern lady. She never raised her voice, never showed emotion in public, and managed the household with precise discipline. They had 3 children. Victoria was 16. Blessed with her mother's delicate features and an intense devotion to proper behavior. Thomas was 14 and already being shaped to inherit the estate. Little Anne was only 8, still untouched by the harsh realities of the world she lived in. Among the enslaved people was a young man named Samuel. He was 24 years old, though no one knew his exact birth date. Such details were rarely recorded for those considered property. Samuel worked mostly inside the main house, serving meals, caring for the library, polishing silver, and handling the many unseen tasks that kept wealthy families comfortable. What set Samuel apart was not only his intelligence, though he was sharp despite being forbidden to read. It was not just his quiet dignity, though he carried himself with a calm presence that unsettled visitors. What truly made Samuel different was something no one dared speak of openly, something that lived in careful glances and eyes quickly turned away. Samuel looked almost exactly like Charles Belmont, not merely similar, not faintly familiar, but nearly identical, the same strong jaw, the same deep, set hazel eyes that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, the same widow's peak, the same tall and broad-shouldered frame, the same long fingers, and even the same slight tilt of the head when listening. The resemblance was so striking that visiting guests would sometimes pause in confusion, their minds briefly unsettled by what they saw. But those moments passed quickly. In the South of 1847, certain truths were understood without being spoken, and some resemblances were better left unexplored. Margaret Belmont had rules. Samuel was never allowed to serve dinner when guests arrived from Charleston or Savannah, people who knew her family and might ask uncomfortable questions. On those nights, Jacob, an older enslaved man with gray hair and weathered features, replaced him. Samuel was never present in the same room as Charles during family portraits or formal gatherings that might be photographed or painted. Margaret planned these events carefully, always making sure Samuel was assigned elsewhere. He was never to speak unless spoken to, never to look Victoria directly in the eyes, and never under any circumstances to be seen standing beside Charles Belmont where comparisons could easily be made. These rules were never spoken aloud, They were simply understood and enforced through sharp looks from the head housekeeper, Denina, a woman in her 50s who had served the Belmont family since before Charles was born. Denina knew things, she had seen things, and she understood that her survival, and Samuel's, depended on maintaining very clear boundaries. There was something else that made the situation even more difficult. Margaret treated Samuel differently, not with kindness. Margaret was never openly cruel to any enslaved person. That would have gone against her sense of dignity. But with Samuel, her coldness went beyond her usual distance. When he served her tea, she never thanked him, while she might offer a brief nod to others. When he entered a room, her shoulders would tighten just slightly. She found small faults. The silver was never polished enough, the curtains never perfectly straight, and she made sure Denina corrected him. It was the behavior of someone who resented a wrong they could not undo. Charles, however, showed a different kind of strangeness. He never looked directly at Samuel. Not once. When Samuel served his meals, Charles stared at his plate, the wall, or his wife, anywhere but at the young man standing 3 feet away. When Samuel spoke in reply to a question, Charles would nod without lifting his eyes. The other enslaved people noticed. At night, in the quarters, they whispered about it in broken sentences and hushed tones. The master scared of his own face, old Marcus muttered one evening, staring into the small fire they had built for warmth. "Hush that talk," Dina snapped, though her eyes showed she agreed. Some truths were dangerous for everyone. Samuel himself rarely spoke of it. What was there to say? He had grown up on the Belmont estate, born to Lily, a woman who worked in the main house until she died of fever when Samuel was 12. Lily had once been beautiful, with soft features and intelligent eyes she was never allowed to fully use. She carried her secrets with her to the grave. In April of 1849, everything shifted with the arrival of Dr. William Harrison. Harrison was a physician from Boston traveling through the South to study blood diseases and inherited conditions. He had developed theories about blood types and family traits, ideas far ahead of their time and not fully understood for another 50 years. He was collecting family medical histories, searching for patterns in inherited features and illnesses passed through generations. Charles Belmont, always eager to appear modern and enlightened, invited Dr. Harrison to stay at the estate for 2 weeks. Hosting a respected Northern scientist would reflect well on him and suggest that Southern gentlemen valued knowledge and progress. Harrison arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage filled with medical tools, notebooks, and instruments that fascinated young Thomas. Margaret arranged a formal welcoming dinner, inviting neighboring plantation owners to meet their educated guest. Samuel served the meal. Harrison was in the middle of a conversation with Charles about Harvard, which they had attended years apart, when Samuel leaned forward to pour wine. The doctor stopped mid-sentence, his eyes moving between Samuel and Charles with the trained focus of a man used to noticing details. "Remarkable," Harrison said quietly. The table went still. Margaret's hand tightened around her fork. "What is?" Charles asked, his voice carefully steady. "Your servants here, well-built, strong health," Harrison replied, catching himself as he lifted his glass. "Proper nutrition is essential. Many plantations neglect basic health care." The conversation continued, but Margaret had seen that moment, that brief spark of scientific interest as Harrison's eyes moved between her husband and the enslaved man serving him. Over the next few days, Dr. Harrison continued his work. He questioned the Belmont family about their medical history, who died of what illnesses appeared often, and whether there were any unusual traits. He sketched family trees and tracked inheritance patterns. Margaret watched closely, finding reasons to remain nearby, gently guiding conversations away from certain subjects. On the 5th day, Harrison asked Charles an unexpected question during an afternoon discussion in the study. "Did your father keep detailed plantation records? Medical notes, birth records, anything of that sort?" "Some," Charles answered carefully. "Why do you ask?" "I study hereditary patterns across generations. Sometimes examining the health of an entire estate reveals fascinating connections," Harrison said with a polite smile. "Would you allow me to review those records for research purposes?" Charles hesitated. "They may not be very helpful. They're incomplete." "Even so, I would appreciate the opportunity," Harrison replied, his tone making it clear this was not a casual request. Charles agreed and led him to the estate office, where decades of ledgers were stored behind locked cabinets. Harrison spent 3 days there. What he discovered began to form a picture that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Belmont records were careful in some areas and strangely silent in others. Financial dealings were documented meticulously. Every purchase, every sale, every expense was written down. Birth records for enslaved people were included too, but they were usually brief and impersonal, just lines like Lily, female infant born March, or Marcus, male infant born to Sarah. There were no family details, no stories, only facts that treated human lives like inventory. But Dr. Harrison was not focused on the ordinary entries. He was studying the empty spaces, the contradictions, the moments where the careful accounting suddenly became unclear or incomplete. In March of 1825 there was a clear entry: Lily, age 16, assigned to house duties. The note was short, but it marked a change in her role on the estate. Then, in December of 1825, something strange appeared. Several pages had been torn out of the ledger. The record jumped from December 3rd straight to December 28th with no explanation at all. No missing payments were mentioned, no reason given. In January of 1826, there was another short note: Lily confined to quarters, ill. No further detail followed. Then in April of 1826, there was a single unsettling line: male infant born, healthy, no mother listed, no name recorded. Just that one sentence, unusually brief and oddly detached. 2 pages later came another entry: Samuel, male infant, born to Lily, April 1826. Harrison began comparing this with other records from the same time. In December of 1825, Charles Belmont Sr., the father of the current Charles, had made a large payment to a doctor from Mobile. It was marked as consultation fees, but the amount was far higher than a normal medical visit. In January of 1826, Charles Sr. had been away from the estate for 3 weeks, another unusual detail. The plantation ledger claimed business in New Orleans, yet no matching business expenses appeared in the financial books. Harrison uncovered one more detail. Tucked into one of the ledgers was a fragment of a letter being used as a bookmark. It was dated December 1825 and written in the handwriting of an elderly woman. It was addressed to Charles Belmont Sr. The words were sharp and direct: "You cannot escape the consequences of your actions. That girl is 16 years old. What you have done is your responsibility, and God will judge you for it. Even if the law does not, you must make provisions." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched other letters written by Abigail Belmont, Charles Sr.'s mother. She was known for her strict moral beliefs and had died in 1827. Harrison leaned back in his chair as the pieces came together into a picture that could not be denied. Charles Belmont Sr. had fathered a child with Lily when she was only 16 years old. That child was Samuel. This meant Samuel was the half-brother of the current Charles Belmont and the uncle of Victoria, Thomas, and Anne. Charles had been born in 1820, making him 6 years old when Samuel was born. Old enough, perhaps, to remember tension in the household, quiet arguments, and his grandmother's silent disapproval. Did Charles know the truth? Harrison believed he did. It explained the distance, the strict rules, and the way Charles carefully managed the household to ensure he and Samuel were never in the same social space at the same time. Did Margaret know as well? Harrison suspected she did. That explained her coldness toward Samuel, her deliberate exclusions. Her cruelty was not random. It came from resentment. Samuel was a living reminder of her husband's bloodline, proof that her children shared ancestry with an enslaved man. The purity she obsessed over had already been broken. But Harrison found something else, something that turned this from a grim but familiar story of exploitation into something far more disturbing. In the medical records he requested from the local doctor who treated the Belmont family, there was detailed documentation of a serious illness that struck Victoria in 1847, 2 years before Harrison arrived. She had developed a high fever and a strange bleeding condition. The doctor had been confused and tried multiple treatments, all of which failed. Victoria weakened rapidly, becoming pale and frail until there was real fear she would die. The doctor's notes described a desperate measure. Patient required blood replacement. Standard leaching failed. Attempted direct blood transfusion as experimental treatment. In 1847, blood transfusion was extremely rare and very dangerous. It was barely understood. The notes continued. Family members tested for compatibility. Mother showed severe reaction, unsuitable. Father showed moderate reaction, too risky. Brother Thomas, too young, unsuitable. Household searched for compatible donor. Successful transfusion performed using household servants. Remarkable compatibility. Patient responded well. Recovery began within 24 hours. Harrison's hands shook slightly as he read this. They had used Samuel's blood to save Victoria's life. In 1847, doctors did not understand blood types. The blood type system would not be discovered until 1901. Transfusions were mostly guesswork and often ended in death. The fact that Samuel's blood not only failed to harm Victoria but saved her was deeply significant. It suggested close genetic compatibility. It suggested family. Harrison reread the notes carefully. The doctor had commented on the similarity in the appearance and behavior of the blood samples taken from Samuel and the Belmont family. He had found it curious but had not drawn conclusions beyond the success of the procedure. Harrison understood exactly what it meant. The Belmont family had used Samuel's blood, the blood of Charles's half-brother, to save Charles's daughter. They had shared blood in the most direct way possible. Victoria was alive because the enslaved man who served her meals carried the same bloodline she did. And they all knew. Charles had been present during the transfusion. He had watched Samuel's blood flow into his daughter's veins. Margaret had been there too, watching the man she resented most save the child she loved most. Victoria herself had been half-conscious but aware enough to understand what was happening. The secret was no longer just about Samuel's birth. It was about a debt that could never be spoken. A life saved by blood that officially was not supposed to be related at all. Harrison closed the medical records, his thoughts racing. He was a man of science, but he was also from Boston, where abolitionist beliefs were strong. He had seen slavery firsthand during his travels in the South. He had documented medical neglect, preventable illness, and shortened lives. But this was different. This was a family kept alive by the very man they enslaved, bound by blood they refused to acknowledge. Dr. Harrison made a decision that would prove disastrous. On his 10th day at the estate, he asked for a private conversation with Charles. They met in the study after dinner. Brandy was poured and the door was closed. Margaret lingered in the hallway, her embroidery forgotten in her lap, guided by the instincts of someone always alert to danger. "Mr. Belmont," Harrison began, "my research here has been enlightening." Charles stiffened slightly. "I am glad to have been of assistance to your scientific work. I have reviewed your family's medical history in detail," Harrison continued. "The records, the treatments, the interventions over the years." He paused. "Including your daughter's recovery in 1847, the room seemed to grow colder. Victoria's illness was a difficult time," Charles said carefully. "We are grateful to God for her recovery." "And to Samuel?" Harrison asked softly. Charles's grip tightened on his glass. "Samuel performed a service when requested. A service others could not provide." Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Belmont, I am a man of science. I understand inheritance and blood compatibility. I have also studied your estate records closely." "You overstep, sir. Or am I simply saying what everyone in this house already knows but refuses to speak? Your father's actions created a situation that still continues." Charles stood suddenly, his face flushed. "You know nothing of my family's private affairs. You come here as a guest, abuse my hospitality, and pry into confidential matters." "I point out an injustice," Harrison said. "That young man is your brother, and you keep him enslaved." The word hung in the air. "Brother." Charles's face shifted through anger, fear, shame, and finally hardened. "Samuel is property of this estate, as documented by law. The circumstances of his birth changed nothing." Charles moved toward the door. "Your stay here is over, Dr. Harrison. A carriage will take you to Mobile in the morning." The conversation ended, but the damage was done. Margaret had heard everything through the door, her face pale, her hands shaking. Victoria had stopped on the stairs, listening in horror. Samuel stood frozen in the hallway, hearing the truth of his parentage spoken aloud for the first time. Dr. Harrison left the next morning under heavy tension. Charles did not see him off. Margaret appeared briefly, polite but cold. The visit had cracked something open that could not be closed again. Victoria stopped eating. She sat at the table, staring at her plate, watching Samuel as he served. She searched his face for a resemblance she had never noticed before. Now she could not unsee it. The uncle who saved her life served her in silence. His blood ran in her veins, yet he owned nothing and had no future beyond service. She began asking questions that Margaret refused to answer. "Mother, why does Samuel resemble father so much?" "You're imagining things. Finish your dinner." "I'm not imagining it. Everyone notices. Why does nobody ever talk about it?" "Victoria, this is not something we discuss. Is it true then? Is he father's brother?" Margaret struck the table with a force that shocked them all, making the crystal glasses tremble. "You will never ask that again. Do you hear me?" Victoria heard her clearly. She understood that the answer was yes. Thomas overheard parts of these exchanges and began forming his own thoughts. He had always been a sharp child, good with numbers and reasoning. He started adding up ages, replaying family stories he had heard before, noticing details he had once ignored. Their grandmother's portrait had the same eyes Samuel had. Father always found reasons to avoid certain rooms when Samuel was assigned there. Anne, only 10 years old, could not understand the tension, but she felt it deeply. She began waking from bad dreams, crying at night for comfort that came slowly, if it came at all. The house itself felt like it was splitting apart. Samuel, meanwhile, was facing his own quiet disaster. At 24, he had learned the confirmed truth of something he may have suspected but never allowed himself to believe. Charles Belmont, the man who owned him, was his half-brother. The children he waited on were his niece and nephews. The blood taken from him to save Victoria had not matched by luck. It was family blood. Samuel caught himself staring at Charles during the rare moments they crossed paths, searching for something, recognition, regret, even a trace of humanity. But Charles had mastered avoidance. His eyes slid past Samuel as though he were no more than a chair or a wall. Dina noticed Samuel's growing unease and pulled him aside one evening in the kitchen. "You needed to push this deep down," she whispered urgently. "Nothing good comes from this truth being spoken. Do you hear me?" "How am I supposed to pretend I don't know?" Samuel said, his voice tight. "How am I supposed to live with it?" "You survived," Dina said. "The same way your mother survived, the same way all of us survive." She gripped his shoulders firmly. "The master will never acknowledge you. He cannot. It would ruin everything, his marriage, his reputation, his children's future. And if you force it, if you make it impossible to ignore, he will fix the problem the only way he knows how." Samuel understood what she meant. He could be sold, sent far away, where the resemblance would no longer matter, where the truth could be erased by distance or something worse. "But they used my blood," Samuel said softly. "They took it to save her." "And you think that gives you rights?" Dina replied sadly. "You think that makes you family? Boy, it only makes you useful. Don't confuse necessity with acceptance." Victoria Belmont had been raised to be a proper Southern young lady, obedient, graceful, careful about reputation and marriage. At 18 in 1849, she should have been thinking about dances and eligible young men. Instead, she was trapped in a moral storm. She could not stop thinking about the fever, the confusion. The moment she woke to see Samuel's face pale from blood loss while the doctor worked with crude tools to move life from his body into hers. She had asked weakly what was happening, and her father had said, "He's helping you, don't speak. Save your strength, he's helping you. Not a relative, not family, just a servant." Victoria began doing something dangerous. She began seeing Samuel as a human being. She noticed how he read book titles while shelving them, his fingers pausing on the spines as if memorizing words he had never been taught to read. She noticed how gentle he was with Anne when the child ran through the halls, steadying her with a hand and a quiet, careful warning filled with warmth. She noticed his hands were just like their grandmother's, long fingers, the same shape of nails. One afternoon, when her mother was out visiting and her father was in the fields, Victoria broke every rule. She went into the kitchen where Samuel was polishing silver and dismissed the other servants. "I need to speak with you," she said softly. Samuel looked up, alarm clear in his eyes. "Miss Victoria, that isn't proper. 2 years ago," she said, "you saved my life." Silence followed. "I was dying, and they used your blood because our own family blood couldn't save me." Her voice shook. "Why did you do it?" Samuel looked down at the silver. "I wasn't asked, miss. I was told." "But if you had a choice," she pressed, "would you have done it?" Samuel met her eyes for the first time. "You were 14 and dying. Whatever else is true or false, you were a child." "So yes, I would have chosen to help. You're my uncle," Victoria whispered. "I'm nothing official, miss, and saying that puts us both in danger. But it's the truth. Truth doesn't matter much when the law says otherwise." Samuel set the silver down. "You should leave. This conversation cannot happen." But Victoria stayed. "What if I could change it?" she asked. "What if I could make them admit it?" Samuel gave a bitter laugh. "How? You're 18 and a woman. You own nothing. You decide nothing. You're nearly property yourself, just housed better." "I'll find a way," Victoria said firmly. "You gave me life. I won't live it pretending you don't matter." What she did next was surprisingly clever for someone with no power. She began with papers. Over weeks, she quietly removed pages from her father's study while he was distracted, old ledger pages showing missing entries, strange payments, dates that lined up with Samuel's birth. She took little enough to avoid suspicion, but enough to matter. She also began writing letters to her Aunt Clara in Charleston, Margaret's sister, known for her progressive ideas and past discomfort with slavery. The letters were careful, asking about family secrets and moral duty without naming names. Clara replied, curious, asking for more. Victoria answered in coded language, describing a family member denied recognition because of birth. Clara understood immediately. She wrote back that it was a serious moral matter, but warned there was no legal solution. The law would not bend. "What about morally?" Victoria replied. "What about before God? You said slavery is a sin. Is it not worse when it is our own blood?" The letters continued for months. Clara, wealthy and childless from her late husband's shipping fortune, began forming an idea. The tension at Belmont grew unbearable. Charles learned that Harrison had studied old records closely and grew fearful of what the doctor might know or say. He wrote to medical groups Harrison belonged to, quietly damaging his reputation in case he spoke. Margaret tightened her grip on the household, adding stricter rules for Samuel. She reassigned him from housework to the fields, a clear punishment though no one named it. Samuel's body was not suited for field labor after years indoors. His hands blistered and bled during harvest. His back ached constantly. Dina protested. "He's a house servant. He isn't built for this." "Then he will become so," Margaret replied coldly. Victoria watched Samuel weaken week by week, returning at night with wrapped hands and stiff movements. In November of 1849 she wrote to Aunt Clara, saying she was ready to act, whatever the cost. Clara arrived in December, her carriage full, announcing a long Christmas visit. Margaret could not refuse her. What she did not know was that Clara had brought legal papers prepared by a progressive lawyer. A dangerous plan. Clara spent days watching everything, Margaret's control, Charles's avoidance, Samuel's obvious resemblance. She listened to Victoria's whispered explanations at night. "Are you certain?" Clara asked. "There is no turning back. Your parents may cast you out, society will reject you." "He saved my life," Victoria said, "and they punished him for existing." "This won't free him," Clara warned. "The law will not change, I know," Victoria said. "But freedom has more than one meaning." Clara nodded. "Then we move forward very carefully." The plan depended on rare legal loopholes. Clara would purchase Samuel from Charles, something unusual but not unheard of. Enslaved people were often sold to each other for many reasons. Charles had no clear reason to reject a strong offer from his sister-in-law. Once Samuel became Clara's legal property, she would take him to Charleston. South Carolina law still upheld slavery, but it also contained certain provisions. One of these allowed for voluntary enslavement, a legal condition in which an enslaved person could technically choose to remain enslaved rather than face the severe dangers of being a free black person in the South. More importantly, within that same legal system, there existed a rarely used clause that allowed for manumission under specific circumstances, including relocation to a northern state. Clara planned to take Samuel to Pennsylvania, where she had established connections with abolitionist groups. There, she would legally free him and assist him in creating a new identity. Victoria's role was entirely different. She would create undeniable public evidence of Samuel's parentage and the blood transfusion that had saved her life. This was not meant to change his legal status, which was impossible under the law, but to create a permanent historical record, one that could not be erased or denied by future generations of the Belmont family. In a way, it was revenge against a family that placed reputation above truth, a lasting stain on the Belmont name, preserved in official records and accessible to historians, genealogists, or anyone who cared to look closely. The plan was dangerous and could have been deadly if mishandled, but Clara was wealthy enough to be nearly untouchable, and Victoria was determined enough to accept whatever consequences followed. They began in mid-December of 1849. Clara approached Charles casually one afternoon while he reviewed financial records in his study. "Charles, I have a proposal for you," she said. He glanced up, distracted.
"Yes."
"I need a personal manservant for my home in Charleston, someone trained, reliable, and capable of running a large household." Clara lowered herself into a chair. "I've noticed you have a young man here, Samuel, I believe. He seems quite capable." Charles froze, his pen stopping mid-stroke. "I'd like to purchase him," Clara continued calmly. "I'm willing to pay above market value, let's say $1,200. It was well above the standard price. Charles could certainly use the money. The plantation always required more capital. Still, he stared at Clara with suspicion. "Samuel performs his duties adequately here," he said. "I'm not sure I wish to sell him." "Come now, Charles. You have no shortage of house servants. Margaret mentioned that you recently assigned him to field work anyway, which suggests he isn't essential to the household." Clara smiled politely. $1,200 is generous. Consider it a gesture of family goodwill." Charles felt cornered. Refusing such an offer from his sister in law without a solid explanation would raise questions. He could not say, "I can't sell him because he is my half-brother, and keeping him nearby is already complicated." "I'll think it over," he finally said. "Wonderful. Shall we say you'll give me your answer by the end of the week?" That evening, Charles discussed the matter with Margaret in their bedroom. "She knows," Margaret said at once. Victoria told her. "This is some kind of plan." "A plan to do what?" Charles asked. "To buy him and take him to Charleston. That removes the problem from this house." "Does it?" Margaret's eyes were sharp. "Or does it place him with someone who might free him, educate him, and create an even greater scandal?" "Clara wouldn't," Charles said weakly. "She's always been soft on the slavery issue. You know she supports gradual abolition." Margaret paced the room. "If she takes him, we lose all control." "We already have no control," Charles replied tiredly. "Harrison knows, Victoria knows. Likely half the household knows. The secret is already exposed. The best we can do is manage the damage by selling him to your sister and removing the visible reminder of your father's mistake," Margaret said coldly. They agreed to the sale. Charles told himself it was purely business. Yet when he signed the bill of sale 3 days later, his hand trembled and the ink smudged the page. Samuel was informed that he had been sold and would leave for Charleston after Christmas. He accepted the news in silence, his expression unreadable. That night, in the servants' quarters, he cried for the first time since his mother's death. Not because he was leaving, but because of the crushing confusion and grief. Grief for a family that was never his, for a brother who never acknowledged him, and for a life that might have been different had he been born in the main house instead of a cabin. Before they departed, Victoria carried out her part of the plan. She visited Judge Morrison, an old family friend who had known the Belmonts for decades. She requested a private meeting, explaining that she needed to make a formal deposition for family records. Though confused, the elderly judge agreed. Such statements were sometimes made for inheritance or historical purposes. Victoria arrived with a written testimony she had prepared with great care. "I, Victoria Belmont, being of sound mind, do hereby testify to the following facts for the historical record. In October of 1847, I suffered a severe illness that brought me close to death. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Matthews of Willow County, attempted multiple treatments without success. As a final experimental effort, Dr. Matthews attempted a blood transfusion, a rare medical procedure at the time. My mother, Margaret Belmont, was tested and found incompatible. My father, Charles Belmont, was tested and found moderately compatible, but the doctor judged the risk too high. The enslaved man, Samuel, property of the Belmont estate, was tested and found highly compatible. The transfusion was performed successfully, and I credit my survival to this act. I further testify that Samuel bears strong physical resemblance to my father and to my paternal grandmother, the late Abigail Belmont. This resemblance has been noted by many household members and visitors over the years. Based on estate records and family correspondence, I believe Samuel to be the biological son of my grandfather, Charles Belmont Sr., and the enslaved woman Lily, who died in 1838. This makes Samuel my father's half-brother and my biological uncle. I make this statement not to challenge any legal standing, as I understand the law is firm in such matters, but to ensure the truth is preserved. The blood that flows in my veins and saved my life belongs to a man denied his rightful place in our family. Signed this 22nd day of December 1849, Victoria Belmont. Judge Morrison read the document slowly, his face growing pale. Miss Victoria, do you understand what you are creating? He asked. Yes, sir. A truthful record. This will destroy your family's reputation. My father already knows the truth, so does my mother. Anyone who looks closely can see it. I am only making sure it cannot be forgotten. After a long silence, the judge notarized the document. This will be placed in county records, he said quietly. It will exist permanently. Good, Victoria replied. She left his office feeling lighter than she had in months, fully aware of what awaited her. Her parents' anger, social isolation, perhaps being sent away. Still, the truth was now official. Charles Belmont learned of the deposition 2 days later, when Judge Morrison sent him a private note. The fury that followed shook the household. Charles burst into Victoria's room, the notarized document clenched in his hand. "What have you done?" he shouted. "I told the truth," Victoria said calmly. "You have destroyed this family," he roared. "People will know that we enslaved our own blood." "He has your blood," she replied. Margaret rushed in, saw the document, and went pale. "You foolish girl," she whispered. "You've ruined everything." "I exposed what was already there," Victoria said. "You will be sent away," Charles said coldly. "To your Aunt Beatrice in Virginia." "I won't go," Victoria answered evenly. "If I disappear now, it will only draw more attention. You taught me to think strategically. You just never expected me to use it against you." Samuel left for Charleston with Clara on December 28, 1849. No one from the family came to see him off except Victoria. She stood beside the carriage. "I don't know if what I did helped you," she said quietly. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "You tried to set things right. That's more than anyone else ever did. Aunt Clara will look after you. She's taking me north to freedom." Samuel glanced back toward the house. "That's more than I ever thought I'd get. It's still less than you deserve." "Maybe." Samuel's face was hard to read. "Miss Victoria, when you look at yourself in the mirror, you'll see my blood in you. Don't forget that. It made you strong enough to do this. That has value." Clara called out from the carriage. "We have to leave. The ferry will not wait." Victoria watched as the carriage rolled away. She kept watching until it vanished down Oakline Drive. She did not cry. All her tears were already gone. Behind her she heard the door to her father's study slam shut. The argument that followed dragged on for weeks. Victoria was confined to her bedroom, her food delivered by servants who were forbidden to speak to her. Letters from Aunt Clara were taken and destroyed before she could ever see them. Charles contacted every suitable family within 200 miles, making sure they understood that Victoria was emotionally unstable and unfit for marriage. He worked carefully and deliberately, tearing down her future as punishment for her defiance. Victoria had expected this. She had made her choice knowing what it would cost her. What she had not expected was Thomas's response. Thomas was 16 now, old enough to grasp what Victoria had revealed. At first, he had been furious with her for disgracing the family, but as the weeks passed and he watched his parents' behavior grow more erratic, he began to doubt everything he had been taught. One night, he slipped into Victoria's room, avoiding their mother's watchful eyes. "Is it true?" he asked without any introduction. "Is Samuel really grandfather's son?" Victoria, thin and pale from weeks alone, nodded. "The records show it." The blood transfusion proves it. Thomas swallowed hard. So we enslaved our own uncle? Yes. He sat on the edge of her bed, burying his face in his hands. How do we live with that? Father seems to manage, Victoria said sharply. Father drinks until he passes out every night. Mother hasn't smiled in weeks. You're locked up like a criminal. Anne keeps asking what's wrong and no one will answer her. Thomas looked up. That's not managing. That's everything falling apart. Good, Victoria said fiercely. Maybe it should fall apart. Maybe it was built on things that deserve to crumble. Thomas left without replying, but something inside him had changed. In the months that followed, Thomas began his own search for the truth. He read his grandfather's old letters, studied estate documents, and spoke with elderly enslaved people who had lived on the plantation for decades. Every detail confirmed what he already feared. His grandfather had fathered a child with a 16-year-old enslaved girl. Instead of freeing the boy, he kept him enslaved. When the old man died, Charles inherited the land, the debts, the silver, and the secret. Charles had known, or at least suspected, and he had done nothing. He had kept his own half-brother in chains, taken his blood to save Victoria, and then sent him to brutal field labor when the truth threatened to surface. The weight of this knowledge changed Thomas deeply. He stopped joining family prayers and stopped pretending that life was normal. He grew quiet and distant, taking long walks by himself. Margaret noticed. "That girl has filled your head with poison," she said one evening. Victoria told the truth. Thomas answered, "That isn't poison. Truth is dangerous when it destroys good order. Maybe the order was never that good." Margaret struck him, the sound sharp in the silent parlor. It was the first and last time she ever hit one of her children. She immediately broke down in tears, not from regret, but from the realization that she was losing control, that the careful structure she had built was coming apart. In March of 1850, a letter arrived from Clara. It was addressed to Victoria, but Margaret intercepted it and read it with trembling hands. "Dearest Victoria, our friend arrived safely in Philadelphia. The journey was long but peaceful. He is staying with trusted associates of mine, kind people helping him adjust to his new life. The legal process was completed here in Pennsylvania. Under Northern law, he is now a free man, though we both know he can never safely return south. He asked me to share his gratitude with you. He says you gave him something he never believed he would have. Recognition. Even though it came at great cost to you, he wants you to know it mattered. He is learning to read. The first book he asked for was a Bible his mother once described to him. The second was a medical text. He wants to understand the process that saved your life. He has chosen a new last name for his freedom papers, Freeman. He knows it is common, but says it captures exactly who he is now. With love, Aunt Clara." Margaret read the letter 3 times, her anger growing with each word. Samuel was free. The living proof of her husband's shame, the reminder of her family's moral failure, was now beyond her reach, living freely in the North, learning to read, claiming a dignity Southern society insisted he did not deserve, and Victoria had made it happen. That night Margaret made a decision. She would erase Victoria from the family, just as they had tried to erase Samuel. She spread whispers through her social circles that Victoria was unstable, obsessed with false ideas and improper thoughts. She contacted convents in Louisiana and Georgia, places that accepted troubled young women from respectable families for long, undefined stays. Charles, lost in drink and guilt, offered no opposition. Before Margaret could send Victoria away, something unexpected occurred. Judge Morrison died peacefully in his sleep in April of 1850 at 74 years old. His funeral drew a large crowd. He had been respected for decades. But when his will was read, there was a surprise. He had left a sealed letter to be delivered to the Alabama Historical Society. Inside were copies of Victoria's deposition and supporting plantation records the judge had gathered before his death. The letter also included his own statement. "I have served the law for 50 years and have often compromised my conscience for the sake of social order. But some truths deserve preservation, even when they cause discomfort." These documents describe a case where legal ownership clashed with blood ties and moral responsibility. They show how the Belmont family of Willow County kept a man enslaved who was by blood one of their own, I submit this not to attack the law, but to ensure that future generations, when they examine slavery more honestly, will have evidence of its deep moral corruption, including the enslavement of one's own family. This is my testimony, and I stand by it. Judge William Morrison, April 1850. When word spread, as it always did in small communities, the effects on the Belmont family were severe. They were not fully shunned, as they were too wealthy for that, but they became the focus of gossip and judgment. Families who once sought Victoria as a bride made it clear their sons were no longer interested. Business partners grew distant. Churchwomen whispered. The perfect image Margaret had guarded for decades collapsed within weeks. Charles withdrew completely, managing the plantation from his study and seeing no one beyond his household. His drinking worsened and his health declined. Margaret became sharp and rigid, her controlled coldness turning harsh. She dismissed servants for small mistakes, tightened rules, and began attending church 3 times a week. As if devotion alone could repair what was broken, Victoria remained confined to the house, socially ruined and unmarriageable, yet strangely calm. In June of 1851, another letter arrived from Clara, this time addressed to Thomas and reaching him before Margaret could seize it. Dear Thomas, I write to you because I believe you now have the understanding to face difficult truths. Samuel is doing well in Philadelphia. He works as an apprentice to a furniture maker, using skills he learned caring for the Belmont house. He attends reading lessons at night and has joined the free black community here. He asked me to pass along a message meant only for you. He says, "Tell the boy Thomas that blood does not decide who a man is. I share blood with those who owned me, but I share values with those who freed me. He has a choice in what kind of man he becomes. Blood does not choose for him. Thomas, you are 16. One day you will inherit the estate and all that comes with it. Samuel wants you to know that inheritance is a decision, not just a fate. You may choose what to carry forward and what to leave behind. Your Aunt Clara." Thomas read the letter again and again, memorizing every word. Blood does not determine character. The phrase stayed with him like a quiet promise. Slowly, in ways his parents barely noticed amid their own decline, he began to change. He treated the enslaved people with greater respect, learned their names, and asked about their families. He questioned his father's choices and suggested better living conditions. They work better when they're healthy, he argued, hiding morality behind practicality. Charles, too drunk and defeated to resist, often agreed. By 1852, Thomas was effectively running the plantation. Charles was a shadow in his own home, haunted by guilt, alcohol, and the public exposure of his family's disgrace. Margaret withdrew deeper into rigid religion, clinging to control as everything she built continued to slip away. PMSTUI on mania, hosting prayer circles, giving money to missionary groups, always trying to find forgiveness through loud acts of devotion. Victoria stayed unmarried, now 21, already considered past the best age for marriage. She spent her days reading books, writing in notebooks, and teaching Anne about the harsh truths of the world around them. Lessons rooted in honesty instead of the gentle lies their mother preferred to believe. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Samuel was building a real life. He had married a free black woman named Ruth, a skilled seamstress who owned her own small business. Together they lived in a modest house in a mixed neighborhood. Samuel had completed his apprenticeship and was now earning respect as a fine furniture maker, known for strong, careful craftsmanship. He had built a family on his own terms, a family that fully claimed him as one of their own. In 1853, Charles Belmont became gravely ill. The doctor said it was liver disease, almost certainly caused by years of heavy drinking. Charles declined quickly, his skin turning yellow, his strength fading until he could barely rise from his bed. Thomas, now 20, took control of everything. The plantation, the money problems, his mother's increasingly unstable behavior, and the safety of his sisters all fell on his shoulders. One evening in July, when Charles knew death was close, he asked Thomas to come to his bedside. Margaret was at church. They were alone. "There are things you must understand," Charles said weakly, knowing time was short. "I know about Samuel," Thomas replied quietly. "Everyone knows now. Not just about him, but about the choices you made." Charles struggled for air. "My father left me no good options. When he died, Samuel was only 10. I was 27, newly married to your mother and drowning in debt. I had duties. I couldn't free a child and throw him into the world alone. Free black children had no protection, no future. He would have been captured again or starved. He coughed hard. I convinced myself that keeping him here was protecting him. Were you? Thomas asked. Charles closed his eyes. I don't know. Somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing the difference between truth and convenience. When Victoria was sick, you used his blood, Thomas said. I did. Charles whispered. And I've never felt more like a monster. He saved my daughter, and I couldn't even thank him. Because saying thank you meant admitting who he was, and admitting that meant admitting I was wrong, that everything I built was wrong. Charles opened his eyes and looked at his son. Thomas, when this place becomes yours, you'll face the same system, the same impossible choices. You say you'll act differently now. But will you when your children's futures are on the line? When your name, your survival, your wealth are at risk? He grabbed Thomas's hand with surprising force. This system does not reward morality. It punishes it. Then the system must change, Thomas said. Charles let out a bitter laugh. You sound like an abolitionist. It will take a war to change this world, boy. Maybe not in my lifetime, but in yours. And when it comes, everything will burn. He died 3 days later at the age of 47. His final words were confused, broken mutterings about blood brothers and unpaid debts. At just 20 years old, Thomas Belmont inherited a plantation, 83 enslaved people, crushing debts, and a ruined family name. The first thing he did was read every record his father and grandfather had ever kept. He now understood that history depended on what was written down and what was erased. His grandfather had tried to erase Samuel by keeping records vague and incomplete. Victoria had done the opposite, creating proof that could not be denied. Thomas chose to follow Victoria's path and record the truth. He began documenting every enslaved person in detail, full names, family ties, skills, and personal histories. Births were recorded with both parents when known. Deaths were recorded with causes and circumstances. He created records of lives, not just lists of property. Margaret was horrified. You're making them look like people, she said. They are people, Thomas replied. You know what I mean. These papers could be used against us. Against us, Thomas said, or as proof of the truth. Margaret had no answer. Thomas also began changing how the plantation was run. He could not legally free anyone. The law was unforgiving, and doing so would destroy the estate and leave him powerless to help anyone at all. But he could make conditions less brutal. Better housing, better food, medical care, keeping families together, allowing limited education for children. He knew these were small kindnesses inside a deeply evil system. He knew he was still part of it. But he also knew he did not have the power to destroy it outright. I'm trying to be less cruel, he admitted to Victoria one night. I know that's not the same as being good. It's more than Father ever did, Victoria replied. In 1854, Victoria was finally allowed to write directly to Aunt Clara and Samuel. The letters they exchanged over the next years formed a strange but meaningful bond. Families separated by law and distance, connected by blood and circumstance. Samuel wrote about his growing business, about Ruth giving birth to a daughter they named Grace, about his work with the Underground Railroad helping others escape slavery, and about his continued education. Victoria wrote about the plantation, Thomas's changes, their mother's failing health and schooling, and the rising tension between North and South. They never used the words uncle or niece. Caution still lingered, even across distance, but the care in their words made the bond clear. By 1857, the political crisis could no longer be ignored. Slavery was tearing the nation apart. Thomas attended meetings where men openly discussed secession, war, and defending their way of life against the North. He stayed silent, thinking of Samuel in Philadelphia, thinking of the 83 people whose forced labor paid for the chairs these men sat on while planning rebellion. Victoria, now 26 and resigned to a life without marriage, found a new sense of purpose. She secretly taught enslaved children to read, directly breaking Alabama law. If caught, she could be jailed or fined. She did not care. If the system is already collapsing, she told Thomas, then its rules no longer matter. Margaret discovered the illegal school late that year and completely fell apart. Years of trying to protect the family name shattered in a moment. "You're insane," Margaret screamed. "You've lost your mind." "No, Mother," Victoria said calmly. "I've finally found it. You're the one who spent years pretending family wasn't family, pretending blood meant nothing. That is madness." Margaret collapsed. A doctor was summoned and diagnosed nervous exhaustion, prescribing rest and laudanum. Margaret took to her bed, where she would spend most of her remaining years, drifting in and out of medicated sleep. The family was fully broken. Thomas ran the estate while questioning whether it deserved to survive. Victoria continued her illegal school and wrote to abolitionists. Anne, now 16, stood between two worlds, raised in the old ways but educated in new truths by her sister. Then, in April 1861, Fort Sumter was fired upon. War began. Thomas was immediately pressured to join the Confederate Army. At 28, men his age were expected to fight. He delayed as long as possible, citing the estate and his sick mother, but the pressure grew unbearable. In August 1861, he accepted a lieutenant's commission, more to silence questions than from belief. Before leaving, he did something remarkable. He drafted a legal document, properly witnessed and notarized, stating that if he died, every enslaved person on the Belmont estate would be freed and given parcels of land to begin their own lives. It was not immediate freedom which the law forbade, but it was a will, and wills carried power. "If I die in this war," he told Victoria, "the system ends here." "Don't die," she said fiercely. "Come back and tear it down yourself." "I'll try," Thomas said softly. He left for war, leaving Victoria to manage the plantation with their unstable mother and young Anne. The war years were merciless. Food shortages grew. Production dropped as enslaved men were forced into military labor. Victoria struggled to keep everyone alive, torn between holding the estate together and believing it deserved to fall apart. Thomas's letters came rarely. He fought in Tennessee, then Virginia, then Georgia. His words darkened, filled with horror and doubt. "I'm fighting beside men who own nothing," he wrote in 1863. "Men who are poor and dying to protect a system that serves only the rich. What are we doing? Who is this for?" In July 1863, a different letter arrived. It was not from Thomas, but from his commanding officer. Thomas had been badly wounded at Gettysburg. The letter was cold and factual. Lieutenant Thomas Belmont had suffered severe injuries on the second day of battle. Shrapnel wounds to the abdomen, heavy blood loss, infection expected. He was in a field hospital in Virginia. His condition was critical. Victoria read the letter again and again. Punctuation takes time before its meaning fully settles in. Thomas was close to death. She went at once to her mother's room, where Margaret lay drifting in a heavy laudanum fog. "Thomas is badly wounded. We must go to him." Margaret's eyes slowly came into focus. "Virginia. We cannot go to Virginia. There is a war. He is dying, Mother. Then we will pray." Margaret closed her eyes again. "God's will be done." Victoria looked at her mother's weakened body and then chose for herself. She would go alone. The journey north was dangerous and complex. Rail lines were broken by the war. Roads were not safe. Victoria sold her jewelry to pay for the trip, secured papers stating her travel was for a family emergency, and set out with Dina as her only companion. They arrived at the field hospital in early August. It was a place of horror, with hundreds of wounded men packed together, many past saving. Thomas was awake but very weak, his stomach wrapped in bandages dark with blood. The doctor pulled Victoria aside. "Infection has begun. He has lost a great deal of blood. We have very limited supplies. I am sorry, Miss Belmont, but there is little we can do. Keep him comfortable. That is all we have now. There is no treatment. Nothing at all, not with what we have here. In a proper hospital, perhaps, but even then," the doctor let the sentence fade. The meaning was obvious. Victoria stayed with Thomas, holding his hand as she watched him slip away. He drifted in and out, sometimes clear, sometimes lost in fevered thoughts. During one clear moment, he squeezed her hand. "The will. You found it. Yes, it is safe. Make sure it stands. No matter what Mother tries, I will. And Victoria, tell Samuel. Tell him I finally understood. Tell him I am sorry it took so long. You can tell him yourself when you get better." Thomas gave a weak smile. "Do not lie to me. We both know." That night, Victoria sat in the nurse's area thinking about blood. About how Samuel's blood had saved her 6 years earlier. About how Thomas was now dying from losing blood. About someone in Philadelphia who shared family blood the same line as Thomas. It sounded mad. It felt impossible. Philadelphia was hundreds of miles away. There was a war. The planning alone was nearly impossible. Still, Victoria found paper and wrote wildly, explaining everything, begging for help. She sent the letter by express to Clara's address in Philadelphia, paying extra for speed. "Please," she wrote, "if there is any chance at all, I am begging you. He is dying. We need Samuel." She did not truly believe the letter would arrive in time or that Samuel would come even if it did. She was asking him to risk his freedom, to travel back into Confederate land where he could be enslaved again, to save the brother who had inherited ownership over him. Why would he come? Samuel received the letter 4 days later. He was in his workshop in Philadelphia, sawdust on his clothes, Victoria's desperate words shaking in his hands. Ruth watched his face as he read. "What is it? My half-brother is dying in Virginia. Victoria is asking if I will come." Ruth's eyes widened. "The brother who enslaved you. The brother who later freed me, or at least allowed it." Samuel set the letter down. "They need blood for a transfusion, like they did for Victoria." "Samuel, no." Ruth grabbed his arm. "You cannot go south. If they catch you, if anyone learns you are a freed man in Confederate territory, they will enslave you again or worse. There are bounty hunters, I know. Then you know you cannot go." Samuel looked at his wife, then at the letter, then out the window at the free streets of Philadelphia where he walked as a man, not property. "He is dying," Samuel said softly. "He is not your duty. He is my brother. He owned you. I know." Samuel began to pace. "Believe me, Ruth, I know what they did. I know what they took from me. But he is also the one who stopped fighting when Clara wanted to buy me. He is the one who let me go. That does not make it right." "No, but it is something." Samuel stopped walking. "And Victoria gave up everything for me. Her name, her future, her family's standing. She made my existence official. She did not have to do that." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I cannot lose you. I will be careful." "Careful will not matter if you are caught." They argued for hours. In the end, Ruth knew her husband. She knew the code that ruled him, even when it demanded sacrifice. He had risked himself many times helping escaped slaves through Philadelphia. He had given his blood before to save family who barely claimed him. He would go. Samuel left the next morning with Clara, who offered to travel with him and provide cover. She would claim he was her servant if questioned. Abolitionist contacts forged papers naming Samuel as her property, traveling under her protection. The bitter irony of using false slave papers to stay safe was clear to both of them. The journey took 8 days through land torn by war. They were stopped twice by Confederate patrols, but Clara's Charleston accent and commanding tone carried them through. Samuel played the obedient servant, eyes lowered, silent, every lesson drilled into him before freedom. Each moment of that performance was painful. They reached the Virginia Field Hospital on August 19, 1863. Victoria was sitting by Thomas's bed when Dina came for her. "Miss Victoria, you need to come now." Victoria found Samuel and Clara in the receiving area. For a moment she could not speak, stunned that he had truly come, that he had risked everything. "You came, you asked," Samuel said simply. There was no time for reunions. Thomas was worse. The infection was spreading fast. The doctor doubted the transfusion. "I have tried twice this month. Both men died. The process is too risky, too crude." "He is dying anyway," Victoria said. "What does he have to lose? And this man," the doctor said, pointing at Samuel, "he is willing." "I am," Samuel said. The doctor sighed, worn down by months of war medicine. "Very well. I will need hours to prepare." They did the transfusion that evening in a corner of the hospital, using the same rough tools once used on Victoria. Samuel lay on a cot beside Thomas, tubes linking their arms, watching his blood flow into his brother. Thomas barely stirred, but at one point his eyes opened and found Samuel. "You came, of course. I am sorry for everything." "Save your strength," Samuel said gently. "We will talk when you are better." "If I am better when Samuel insisted. "You do not get to die before keeping those promises." Thomas gave a faint smile and slipped back into darkness. The transfusion lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Samuel was pale and dizzy, having given more blood than was safe. Clara and Victoria helped him to recover. "Now we wait," the doctor said. "If he survives the night, he has a chance. They waited together, Victoria, Clara, Dina, and Samuel. 4 lives tied by blood, law, and circumstance, sitting in a Confederate hospital while war thundered outside. "It is strange," Victoria said near midnight. 6 years ago, now it may save Thomas. "Blood is only blood," Samuel said weakly. "It carries life, not morals. But family blood matters." "I do not know if we are family," Samuel said. "We share ancestry. That is biology. Family is choice and recognition." He was too tired to finish. "You chose to come," Victoria said. "That is family." Clara added softly, "Samuel has a family now. A wife, a child, a community that claims him fully. He is not waiting for Belmont approval." "I know," Victoria said, "and I am glad." Near dawn, Thomas's fever broke. His breathing steadied. The doctor examined him in disbelief. "The infection is retreating." His body accepted the transfusion. "Remarkable compatibility. Are you sure this man is not family?" Samuel and Victoria exchanged looks, and stayed silent. Thomas lived. Over the next weeks, he slowly grew stronger. Samuel stayed 10 days until recovery was certain, then prepared to leave with Clara. Before going, Thomas asked to speak with him alone. They sat outside the hospital, 2 men who looked alike, divided by everything but blood. "I cannot undo what was done to you," Thomas said. "I cannot give you back your years or your childhood. No, you cannot. But I promise this. When the war ends, however it ends, I will never own another person. The Belmont estate will change. That is easy to say if the South loses. Even if we win," Thomas said firmly. "Even if slavery survives, I am done." Samuel studied him. "You mean it?" "I do. Your blood is in me now. I cannot deny the connection anymore. We were always connected. This only made it clear." They sat quietly. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "I will build furniture, raise my daughter, live free." Samuel smiled. "It may sound small, but it is everything. It sounds like a good life. It is." They parted without touching. Too many eyes, too much risk. As Samuel walked away, Thomas called his name. "Thank you for coming, for the blood, for all of it." Samuel nodded once and left. He and Clara returned safely to Philadelphia. The journey back was even harder, with deserters' patrols and ruined roads, but they made it. Samuel never saw the Belmonts again. The war ended in April 1865 with after the Confederate surrender. Thomas returned to Alabama in June, injured in both his leg and his spirit. He found the plantation in disorder. The enslaved people had scattered. Some left as soon as they heard about emancipation. Others stayed for a short time because they had nowhere else to go. A few remained for good, unsure how to manage freedom after a lifetime in chains. The main house had been damaged and stripped by passing soldiers, whether Union or Confederate, no one could say. The fields were choked with weeds. The economy had fallen apart. Confederate money was useless. The Belmont wealth, built over many generations, was essentially wiped out. Margaret had died in the final year of the war, her heart giving out in her sleep. Anne had married a local shopkeeper while Thomas was away, looking for security in a world that was falling apart. Victoria, now 34, was still there, running what little remained, and trying to help the newly freed people adjust to a new life without tools, money, or guidance. Thomas kept his word. He sold small pieces of land to former enslaved families for very low prices, offering whatever small amount of money he could gather to help them begin again. He had very little to give. The plantation was buried in debt, but he shared what he could. "It's not enough," he told Victoria. "Nothing I do will ever be enough." She agreed. No, it would never be enough, but it was better than doing nothing. They wrote to Samuel, telling him the war was over, explaining the changes, and informing him of their mother's death. Samuel replied with a letter that was formal but not cruel. He expressed sorrow for their loss, noting that whatever Margaret's flaws, she had still been their mother, and grief was still grief. He said he was relieved the war had ended and glad that the system of slavery was over, at least in law. He admitted that freedom without support was not true freedom. He thanked Thomas for trying to make things right, and said he understood that those efforts came with personal sacrifice. But he wanted them both to understand something important. He no longer needed the Belmont name or recognition. He had once needed it deeply, when he was young and enslaved and believed that acknowledgement might change his life. But now he had built a life without it. He was Samuel Freeman, a furniture maker, a husband, a father, and a free man, That was who he was. What happened at the Belmont estate was part of history. It shaped him, but it did not define him. He felt no hatred toward them as individuals, but he also felt no strong bond beyond shared blood. They were related, yes, but his real family was in Philadelphia, formed by choice, not circumstance. He wished them well in rebuilding sincerely, but believed their connection should remain a matter of record and memory, not an ongoing relationship. He signed the letter respectfully as Samuel Freeman. Thomas and Victoria spent the rest of their lives in the reduced Belmont house, never fully recovering financially or socially from the war or the scandal. Thomas never married. He devoted his remaining years to small acts of repair, giving work to freed people, helping support schools, and speaking in court cases about property rights for black landowners. It was never enough, and he knew it. Victoria also stayed unmarried, finding meaning in teaching and in preserving records. She continued to write everything down, creating a large archive that told the plantation's real story, including both the comforting lies and the painful truths. Anne had 3 children and kept her distance from her siblings, ashamed of the family's name. She never spoke of Samuel and never told her children about that part of their history. In 1878, Thomas learned that Samuel had died from pneumonia in Philadelphia at the age of 52. He left behind a wife, 3 children, and a successful furniture business that his sons would continue. Thomas did not attend the funeral. It would have been difficult and possibly dangerous given the racial climate. Instead, he placed a notice in a Philadelphia newspaper. It read, "In memory of Samuel Freeman, formerly of Alabama, a man of integrity and honor. His blood lives on in those who remember him. May he rest in the peace he earned." It was the most public acknowledgment Thomas felt able to make. Victoria died in 1889 at the age of 58, never having married or left Alabama. In her will, she left her entire historical collection to the Alabama Historical Society, with clear instructions that it be preserved forever. The archives held everything: birth records showing Samuel's origins, medical notes from both transfusions, Victoria's original deposition, Judge Morrison's testimony, letters exchanged among family members, Thomas's will promising freedom, and newspaper articles about the scandal. She recorded it all, creating a solid and undeniable record of the truth. Thomas died in 1891 at the age of 58, alone in the decaying Belmont house. In his final letter written to Samuel's oldest son, he admitted that Samuel had been a better man than he himself had ever been. Samuel had been denied family, freedom, education, and recognition, yet still became someone of real value. Thomas had been given everything and still failed to be truly good. He shared Samuel's blood, but wished he shared his character. He wrote that Samuel mattered, that he was finally acknowledged, and that the debt owed to him was never forgotten, even though it could never truly be repaid. He signed the letter respectfully as Thomas Belmont. The Belmont estate was sold in 1892 to cover debts. The house was torn down in 1920. The land was split into smaller farms, but the written record remained. In the 1930s, a historian studying slavery in Alabama discovered Victoria's archives at the Historical Society. Samuel's story and the Belmont family became a case study in academic work about Southern families, hidden racial mixing, and the deep moral contradictions of slavery. In 1947, exactly 100 years after the first transfusion, a medical researcher examining the history of blood transfusions uncovered the Belmont medical records. The fact that 2 successful transfusions had taken place between close relatives decades before blood types were known became a small note in medical history. Samuel's descendants living in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Chicago eventually learned their ancestors' story. They learned about the plantation where he had been enslaved by his own half-brother. They learned about the blood he gave twice to save relatives who would not claim him. They learned about his escape, his freedom, and the life he built despite everything. They learned that their great-great-grandfather was denied his family name, but created a legacy far stronger than the Belmont name ever held. In the end, the Belmont line disappeared. Anne's descendants changed their name through marriage, distancing themselves from the past. No one carried the Belmont name into the 20th century. But the Freeman name lived on through Samuel's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It was carried by people who knew their history. They knew about the blood that was taken and given. They knew about the family that rejected him but could not erase him. The blood endured. The truth endured. The legacy endured not because it was honored by those who should have recognized it, but because one young woman believed that records mattered more than comfort, and because one freed man chose to give life even to those who denied him his own. The Belmont plantation is gone. The house is gone. The fortune is gone. But in archives, in official records, and in carefully kept family trees, the story remains. A man enslaved by his own blood, a secret hidden for decades and then revealed, a family broken by truth, and a man who became free despite every force designed to keep him bound. The blood they shared could not be denied forever. In the end, truth proved stronger than even silence.